everyone, and welcome back. I have a very exciting video for you today because I haven't been able to dig into a museum collection full of shoes in a while. And that is something that I really love to do because there are so many amazing discoveries and stories to be told out of all of the garments that are in museum collections. And shoes in particular, I feel like they have so much to tell, but they're not often well understood. So finally, I have the opportunity to do that when it's not just my own collection and share it with you. Last month, I was able to go to the Leicestershire Museum collection near Leicester in the UK and peruse all sorts of different shoes. In fact, I looked at about 200 years worth of shoes. I focused mostly on earlier styles, 18th and early 19th century, but there's a really interesting 20th century pair that I have to show you as well. And the best part of all of it is that there were so many interesting discoveries and stories that I found along the way, which I cannot wait to share with you. So we're going to start looking at these shoes in chronological order, and I am going to talk about what I look for when I am searching through these shoes, what I am trying to notice and discover, the details that help me to put dates on them or find out more information about not just the shoes themselves, but who wore them and who made them. Because there is surprisingly a lot of information to be had from such a simple object. The first pair of shoes comes from around the 17 teens. There's an upturn to the toe, and looking from above or below, you can see that there is a pointed toe. And especially from below, you might notice the fact that it's not a really long point. It's not extending far away from the end of the foot. It's not crushing the toes either, but it's got kind of a weird shape. It's just kind of an interesting point that is specific to this early part of the 18th century. Continuing to look at the sole, you'll notice that this is not right or left. It is a straight-laced shoe, meaning that it's symmetrical. As you wear the shoe, pretty quickly it becomes right or left, so you won't see people transferring the shoes back and forth between their feet. They're just lightweight enough that they don't have to be pre-shaped to your foot shape. The heel is also a big giveaway for the era. It's only about 2 inches tall, but it is sturdy. It has curve to it. It has what we consider a Louis heel style. This style of heel is actually made out of wood and is inserted sort of like the last step of the process and stitched into place. You can see those little white stitches around the edge of the heel. That's what's holding the wooden shape of the heel in between the sole and the fabric of the heel cover. As for the uppers, the fabric portion of this particular shoe, the uppers have a really high seam. So the side seams are pretty far up towards the back of the foot. This is again indicative of the era to have that closure so high up on the foot. This particular one ties instead of buckles, another sign that it's pretty early, and we have a very wide square tongue. The most important part here is that little hole on the side though, right by the seam, where the tongue and the straps don't overlap. And this hole is a holdover from the earlier century. So early on in the 17th century, really massive opening on the side, practically look like sandals. And gradually, as the century goes on, it starts to close up and get smaller and smaller. So by the time we reach the 1730s, it's gone. The uppers themselves are made of green silk and they are what we call fully laced, meaning that they are covered in braid. And all of that braid is hand stitched down. It's usually a silk braid, and the edges are also bound in a silk grosgrain ribbon. You can see all of the stitching on the interior of the shoe through the linen inner lining, which usually linen is the full lining for the shoe, but they decided they wanted to cover up all that stitching and put a green silk in instead. That has pretty much completely deteriorated and there's very little of it left. That means that we can see into a little bit more detail. As for the construction of the entire shoe, that is also done by hand in what's called a turn shoe method, where the entire thing is made wrong side out, take it off of the wooden last, flip it right side out, and then deal with the heel. This particular construction requires a fairly lightweight sole and is pretty typical for a very long time, though it's not the only option, as we'll see. In terms of the life of this shoe, you can see that it's been worn, and worn a decent amount. Certainly nowhere near being worn out, but there is a fair amount of abrasion that has occurred to the sole and heel cap of the shoe. I really want you to focus on the fact that it is very uneven. I've worn a lot of historical leather soled shoes over the years, and the only way to get that sort of texture on it is walking on uneven grounds. rocks, gravel, sand, dirt, rather than a paved surface. So this is a great example of a shoe from before the era where everything was paved and finished, because you're still seeing that wear and tear from natural surfaces. As for anything else unusual about this shoe, well, I do want to point out one of my favorite features, the fact that the little stamps on the sole are tiny little flowers, which those are just closing up the nail holes from where the shoemaker nailed the sole to the last in the process of making. But the most obvious, notable thing about this pair of shoes is the fact that they are very wide. The length is not terribly long. I'm estimating around a size 4 US women's. But they are 3.5 inches wide, which is frankly more than an inch wider than would be typical for shoes this size of this era. Probably honestly closer to 1.25 inches wider, and wider than most modern shoes of this size as well, by a good 1/2 inch or more. So this is a very broad shoe, and that helps us remember the fact that these things were custom made and custom fit. And so even when they talk about shoe sizes being smaller, or you look at the shoe and go, wow, that's really short, remember, she didn't have to size up for the width of her foot. She had exactly what she needed and fit. Next up, we are moving into the middle of the 18th century with this pair of shoes. Looking at it from a side, there's no upturn, no toe spring. The toe is round. The point has deflated as we moved into the mid-century. The heel has also deflated quite a bit. It is not nearly as sturdy, though it is similar height. It's not going to go as deep underneath the foot, though the curve that you see there, what we call the heel breast, is going to still extend well enough under the foot to help support the arch. This style of the upper has also changed pretty dramatically, though admittedly there are still similarities between this pair and the previous one, with the fact that it's also fully laced, which is less typical for this era. But you'll notice that the hole has completely closed up and has turned into what we call a dog leg seam. This also notes the fact that, yes, we've moved to buckles at this point in time. They're still fairly high up on the foot and they're not terribly huge, but they are there. The tongue for this pair is still pretty wide and square in shape, so that hasn't changed terribly much. And the construction methods in terms of binding and hand stitching are all going to be pretty similar to the last pair. The only really fun part here is the fact that they inked out where the braid was supposed to be laid down on the straps, but then they decided not to put it there because the buckles would be covering that and potentially getting in the way. The construction of this pair is a little bit different, however. Unlike the turn shoe earlier, this is a randed construction. So the rand is that little white strip that you see around the bottom between the upper and the sole. And this is done not unlike welted shoes, and welted shoes are still a standard construction method for a lot of modern shoes today. The rand is just a little thinner piece of leather that's folded in half and is usually white, though I've seen red as well. So very similar construction, allows for a heavier sole. The wear and tear on this shoe is a little bit more than our last shoe, still very uneven, still very bumpy, and the size is probably closer to a modern US size 6. So a little bit small, but nothing too dramatic. And there's nothing terribly unusual about the shoe aside from maybe that lattice work design. Not atypical, but it's not as common as lots of other options. Next up though, I have two very unusual shoes to show you. The first one dates to the 1780s and is a really great example of that era, except for the fact that, well, that just looks incredibly impossibly tiny. And it is. It is not a doll's shoe. In fact, it is a practice shoe. It is something that would be tasked to an apprentice in the shoemaking trade to show that they can do really fine detailed work and understand the general process of shoes without necessarily wasting a whole bunch of supplies. The reason why I can verify that that's what these are and that they're doll shoes or sample shoes to be sent about or anything like that is that one, they don't come in pairs, and two, the 18th century sample shoes were actually stored along with a men's boot from the early 20th century that does come with notation saying that the person that donated this was a shoemaker. He made this as an apprentice, as a test shoe, as a sample to show that he could do work that was that fine. And there are plenty of other examples in museums of similar things. This isn't a really unusual case. It's just generally they don't survive in the same way. But it makes perfect sense to compare those 18th century sample shoes to this early 20th century boot example. But this first one is a great sample for the 1780s. You can see in this particular example that the buckle is gone. It has continued to scoot its way down the foot and hasn't completely disappeared from all shoes just yet in the 1780s, but open pumps like this are becoming more and more prevalent, and that buckle is going to disappear really soon. They're making use of different colors of leather, which becomes really trendy starting in the 1780s. There's also a bunch of cut work over the toe, in which this pair has beads filling in as well, and there is some ribbon trim that is pleated up around the lower part of the opening. There is still a heel on the shoe, though it is a much finer, smaller heel. As for its cousin shoe, they're probably made around the same time. They could be made by the same person. That's a definite possibility. What I find most interesting about this one is not the upper portion, which is similar in the fact that it's using colorful leather and cutouts on the toe and the little ribbon trim, but this heel. This heel is very, well, it just looks uncomfortable. And there are surviving full-sized examples with similar heels, though quite honestly I would argue that they weren't worn out for a reason. It honestly feels like the heel is not the right size for that particular last, which in this case of using really tiny examples makes perfect sense. But the really exciting thing about both of these is that they're still all hand-stitched, they're still made with the same methods that full-scale shoes would have been made, and they can still be studied in much the same way. Next up, we're moving just a little bit forward into the 1790s. This pair of shoes is perfect for the early 1790s. You can see that the toe is extremely long and pointed, very different from the pointed toe that we saw at the beginning part of the century. When we look at the bottom, they're starting to get really decorative with the sole. There's tons of unusual stamps, and you can see burnishing to create a special design. This pair of shoes hasn't been worn much, if at all, so all of that is really well preserved for us to look at. The heel is very small, it's really short in this era and is starting to disappear. Obviously, with the open pump style, we now have a great opportunity to put some decoration in that front area because there's no longer that buckle there, so they've chosen to have a large rosette. Often those will be made up, sometimes even attached to a little piece of buckram and then attached to the shoe at the very end, so that way you don't have to worry about getting it messed up in the shoemaking process. But there's also that little decorative bit around the front of the pleated ribbon as well. These are made out of a bright green silk satin that was probably much brighter when it was originally made. The lining is made up of linen, as we come to expect, as well as witaw, that white leather in back. Now, witaw is a different way of finishing leather. You can tan leather or you can taw leather. There are other options too, but for right now we're just going to be talking about those two. Tanning with tannins usually produces something that's going to be darker, and if you get it wet, it will bleed. As for tawing, it uses alum salts, and it works really well as a lining, so that way it doesn't rub off on your socks, but it also produces a really beautiful white leather that can be used in lots of other areas. Everything on this is still handmade. It is a turn shoe, just like our first pair. You can see what I like to call a ladder around the edge, where you can actually visibly see all the little indentations and shadows showing through of the stitches that are only going halfway through the thickness of the leather. There's nothing particularly odd about this pair of shoes. It too is probably around a size maybe 5 to 6. Unless I can see the footprint underneath, it's a little bit difficult for me to know how long the foot is. Next up, we have one of my favorite pairs out of this grouping, which is likely from 1816 to 1825. This I know is a little bit of a weird number system to give, but I've looked at a pair of shoes that I can definitively date to 1816 that is very similar, and the end date for this pair of shoes, I wouldn't normally put it quite as far as the mid-1820s, though there are plenty of examples that do. They just start to change their toe shape, except, well, when I started doing research, I found something really interesting. First, let's take a closer look at this pair. It has a square toe, and that's that toe shape that comes in the mid-18 teens and really takes off and takes hold and keeps there until the 1870s. We're going to see different changes in the square toe throughout the century. This one's a little bit narrowed from the joint of the foot and extends pretty far. It's one of the ways to define this versus 1830s square toes, for example. They are still straight last, and they are still made entirely by hand, no machines involved yet. Most notable about the style of the shoe is that it has no heel, and it has a lot of decoration on top. It has all of this really interesting cut work that we were starting to see in the 1780s. This has just added in all of the chain stitch embroidery. This little bit of embroidery is what I want you to keep in your mind's eye as we start to wander to another example that I came across, and you'll notice they're very similar. In fact, nearly identical. And this example is actually up in Scotland, the King's Museum at the University of Aberdeen. And it has a bit more provenance than the other pair does. In fact, it is very likely that it was owned by the sister of Napoleon Bonaparte, and specifically has a handwritten date on it of 1824. So odds are, if this pair of shoes does actually come from 1824, that the pair of shoes that's in Leicestershire is probably also from around that 1822 to 1824 era. What likely happened, and this is a wonderful example of how shoemaking works, is that every single part of the process of shoemaking is often done by different groups of people. So what happens is the embroidery and the design work like that is done separately by one specific group of people who specialize in that, and they will make a lot of those things. They're usually pretty much mass-produced. Then the uncut leather with those designs roughed out on them gets sent off to shoemakers. They will purchase them in whatever styles and colors that they like, and then they will cut them to be the right shape and size for the actual shoe that they need made. They will then hand those usually to someone who is local, and she will do the assembly and the fine stitching work in order to, say, bind the edges, put on the trim, whatever it is, and those will be handed back to the shoemaker who does all the assembly. Sometimes one person, sometimes an entire shop of people specializing. So this is a great example of what is clearly a mass-produced embroidered upper that there's more than one of. In fact, there probably were dozens, if not hundreds, of this exact style. We just happen to have two that survived, which honestly is really rare. I've never come across that before. The only differences between the two are how the shoemakers cut them out and what sort of trim and lining they chose to have put on by that middle person who is assembling the upper. So they're going to be a little bit different, but they started off at the same source. There's no way that they didn't. That's really amazing to know that, and maybe there's a little bit more provenance now to this pair at Leicestershire as well. Next up, we have this pair of side lacing boots from the 1850s. It's a really quick judge of what time period it's from because, one, it has a heel. Heels come in starting in 1851, with a pretty widespread once we get to the mid-1850s. The toe shape is actually kind of rounded. It's a little bit squared, but pretty round, which is not what you would expect for the 1850s. So it does throw a little bit of a wrench into this process. But the more time you spend looking at mid-19th century shoemaking, more you will find that they're really concerned about foot health in this time period, and they're doing all sorts of things to try and figure out how to make the healthiest shoes. For one thing, they move to right and left over straight last. Some will try and put really broad square toes. Some will elevate the front of them so that way there's a taller toe box. Others will get rid of the squareness, thinking that perhaps those little corners aren't the easiest. They might bump on things, they might get in the way. So having a more rounded practical toe is something that is discussed in the era as a potential for healthier shoes. So there's not one specific style that exists in this time period. There are plenty of other options. Usually you expect a square toe up until really the mid-1870s. The heel, though, that's not telling us much, aside from the fact that it's after 1851. It is a stacked leather heel. It is a knock-on style, meaning that this whole thing is made up, finished, shaped, everything by somebody who specifically works in heels, and then the whole thing just gets knocked on, meaning that it's glued into place and then nailed in from the top. So it is done the way that our modern shoes are done. So that leaves us to the uppers to define what era this is from, which they're telling us it's more 1850s. The side lacing style goes out when we get to the 1860s. It's popular from the 1820s forward, still pretty common in this era. It's also definitely a little bit later of a style of side lacing. It has a tongue underneath. It doesn't have metal eyelets yet. It does still have stitched eyelets, but the entire thing is also machine stitched uppers, which again tells us that we're looking more towards the mid 19th century rather than early 19th century when we don't have sewing machines yet, so not really an option. And though this boot does look like a completely black pair of really basic shoes, there is the foxing down at the toe, which is that little extra curvy piece that is added on with a little bit of decorative stitching. And if you look really closely, you might start to notice that the foxing and the rest of the boot are two different types of leather, which makes me wonder if perhaps originally the rest of it was actually a different color, a really dark tone that has over time oxidized a bit. The construction technique of this is an older style, still using the turn shoe technique. It is not cemented together just yet, though that is an option in this era. It hasn't completely taken over as the only choice just yet. It too is probably in that size 6.5 range, and the only oddity that I can really note about it, which is also indicative of the 1850s, is the heel cap. You'll find that it has this embossing done onto it with this fancy little design. This is something that you see on a lot of prize work in the 1850s, just decorative elements to the sole or the heel cap. Of note here, you might also begin to notice the fact that the wear on the bottom isn't quite as uneven and pebbly as it was earlier. We can just barely start to see the footprint here, so it hasn't been worn a lot, but it's a much smoother wear. This brings us into our next pair, which is likely from 1865 to 1875. It does retain the square toe that we were talking about earlier, but it's not a really harsh square toe. It is starting to round, which would be expected by the late 1860s and early 1870s. It is front lacing rather than side lacing. Front lacing has been around for a really long time, but it's gaining in popularity over side lacing at this point. This pair, as well as right and left, has a very narrow waist that curves out to the joint of the foot and continues to a very extended, sort of soft square. The heel is very similar in shape, though it is a wood covered in leather rather than a stacked leather. But on the bottom, you can note that there is a stamp, and this is the maker stamp. In this particular case, I couldn't find a ton about the maker. Our Warner is based out of Liverpool. They were there definitely in 1871, though I haven't found anything on either side of that. One of the most useful things you can find in shoes for dates very often is an address. So a stamp like this or a label on the interior of the shoe, if it has an address for the shoemaker, that can be an absolute goldmine because shoemakers move around a lot. The shops constantly are changing addresses, so that is a really useful thing. This is a little girl's pair of shoes, probably not too terribly young, but not at a teenager level yet, and they really evoke a younger style to them. They are made out of the Whitall leather that we talked about earlier, so bright white. They have a very large, beautiful satin rosette with a mother of pearl buckle on the front, which is attached to buckram and then added on because that giant thing would be a problem in the shoemaking process. The front laces, my favorite feature about them is the fact that the interior facing is made out of a bright pink leather, which is just so cute, though the rest of the interior of the shoe is done in linen. This pair does have metal eyelets of note, which is becoming more and more common by this point. They have very little wear to them, again, just barely visible footprint and abrasion to it. There's nothing atypical about them. I just really appreciate that they have that stamp. This is the point where I intended to stop. I didn't really feel like it was necessary to go into a lot of detail about late 19th century, early 20th century. I have those in my collection. I've talked about them a lot. I've shown making them a lot. But then I came across this pair. These boots are from the early 1920s. I based this off of the heel height and the toe shape. Well, boots like this with similar heels are incredibly popular in the 19-teens. They usually have a much more almond shape or almost pointed toe shape, a little bit daintier of a toe. This higher toe box with a rounder toe is really common in the early 1920s though, and in general this is a pretty flashy pair of boots, especially for the fact that yes, this is supposed to be a practical pair of walking boots. It got a lot of use even. The heel itself is covered in celluloid to get that super shiny finish on it, and in order to match the sole to the heel and the rest of the style of the boot, they've blacked the sole. So one of the reasons we can tell that there's a lot of wear and tear on the shoes, all the black paint or dye, whatever they used, has pretty much worn off underneath the entirety of the foot. So this is a front-laced pair, mid-calf, what looks like snakeskin but is actually fake. So it's embossed and then hand-painted to look more realistic. There's a glazed black leather down around the bottom, and everything in terms of their construction is pretty expected. They are mostly lined in cotton, they have leather facings, they are done with a channel type of stitch. This is a type of stitch that is done through a heavier sole where they sort of cut a channel in and fold back the leather on the edge and then stitch all the way through all the layers at once. So it's pretty typical for the era, especially for heavier shoes of this era. That's completely normal. The thing that makes this pair of boots so spectacular, aside from the general appearance of them being so eye-catching, is the size. All of the shoes that we've talked about so far have been fairly small. sizes 4, 5, 6, children's sizes. We did have a pretty wide pair earlier at the beginning. You can probably tell the difference by looking at the proportions between my hands and the shoes. These are not tiny. In fact, I estimate these to be more like a 10 to 11 women's US. And they're pretty wide too. They're not really narrow. I do want to note that they still are more narrow than that first pair of size 4s we looked at. So notable, this is about 3 inches wide versus 3.5. The calf size on this pair is about 16 inches when closed, so it would easily go up to 18 inches since it has a tongue in front, which is a wider calf that you're going to find on most modern boots. So this pair of shoes was not intended for someone who is really petite, and it was worn a lot. And this is me projecting. I understand. Putting on a pair of boots this flashy and this fantastic, and just the image that it creates. And that's why I wanted to end on that pair of shoes, because there's so much of a story to be told from this one pair of boots, and it's exciting to look at them. They catch your eye. They tell an instant story, not only about the shoes, not only about the person that made them, but about the person that wore them. The person that put those boots on every day and marched her way across the city.